Ethical egoism is the normative ethical position that moral agents ought to do what is in their own self-interest. It differs from psychological egoism, which claims that people can only act in their self-interest. Ethical egoism also differs from rational egoism, which holds that it is rational to act in one's self-interest. Ethical egoism holds that actions whose consequences will benefit the doer can be considered ethical. Ethical egoism contrasts with ethical altruism, which holds that moral agents have an obligation to help others. Egoism and altruism both contrast with ethical utilitarianism, which holds that a moral agent should treat oneself, also known as the subject, with no higher regard than one has for others, as egoism does, by elevating self-interest and the self to a status not granted to others. But it also holds that one should not, as altruism does, sacrifice one's own interests to help others' interests, so long as one's own interests, that is one's own desires or well-being, are substantially equivalent to the other's interests and well-being. Egoism, utilitarianism, and altruism are all forms of consequentialism, but egoism and altruism contrast with utilitarianism, in that egoism and altruism are both agent-focused forms of consequentialism, that is subject-focused or subjective. However, utilitarianism is held to be agent-neutral, that is objective and impartial. It does not treat the subjects, that is the self's, that is the moral agent's, own interests as being more or less important than the interests, desires, or well-being of others. Ethical egoism does not, however, require moral agents to harm the interests and well-being of others when making moral deliberation. For example, what is in an agent's self-interest may be incidentally detrimental, beneficial, or neutral in its effect on others. Individualism allows for others' interest and well-being to be disregarded or not, as long as what is chosen is efficacious in satisfying the self-interest of the agent. Nor does ethical egoism necessarily entail that, in pursuing self-interest, one ought always to do what one wants to do. For example, in the long term, the fulfillment of short-term desires may prove detrimental to the self. Fleeting pleasure, then, takes a back seat to protracted eudaimonia. In the words of James Rachels, ethical egoism endorses selfishness, but it doesn't endorse foolishness. Ethical egoism is often used as a philosophical basis for support of right libertarianism and individualist anarchism. These are political positions based partly on a belief that individuals should not coercively prevent others from exercising freedom of action. Ethical egoism can be broadly divided into three categories: individual, personal, and universal. An individual ethical egoist would hold that all people should do whatever benefits the individual, self-interest. A personal ethical egoist would hold that he or she should act in his or her self-interest, but would make no claims about what anyone else ought to do. A universal ethical egoist would argue that everyone should act in ways that are in their self-interest. Ethical egoism was introduced by the philosopher Henry Sidgwick in his book The Methods of Ethics, written in 1874. Sidgwick compared egoism to the philosophy of utilitarianism, writing that whereas utilitarianism sought to maximize overall pleasure, egoism focused only on maximizing individual pleasure. Philosophers before Sidgwick have also retroactively been identified as ethical egoists. One ancient example is the philosophy of Yang Zhu, 4th century BC, Yangism, who views Wei Wo, or everything for myself, as the only virtue necessary for self-cultivation. Ancient Greek philosophers like Plato, Aristotle and the Stoics were exponents of virtue ethics, and did not accept the formal principle that whatever the good is, we should seek only our own good, or prefer it to the good of others. However, the beliefs of the Cyrenaics have been referred to as a form of egoistic hedonism, and while some refer to Epicure's hedonism as a form of virtue ethics, others argue his ethics are more properly described as ethical egoism.